Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion. Actually, that's a lie, right? This is going to be a new discussion where we're talking about the age of discovery, right? We're talking about basically this thing that is oftentimes referred to as the period of European exploration, where basically the continent of Europe is going to launch several different voyages from about 1450 to 1550, where they're going to discover a lot of stuff. Well, technically it was discovered already by the people that already lived there, but the big thing about it is they're going to run into a bunch of stuff, right? They're going to run into a bunch of stuff, all while trying to gain access to that monsoon marketplace thing that we talked about before, right? So, for example, in the time period that we're about to actually come into contact with, the Europeans had no idea that these two places were there, right? So we need to keep that in the back of our minds. They had no idea that these two places right there existed, right? Exactly. The North Americans, when they actually start launching all these, or not, excuse me, not the North Americans. That was dumb. The Europeans had no clue that North or South America actually even existed, and they only understood anything about the actual Eastern Hemisphere, right? But that's all going to dramatically change right around the end of the 1400s. It's going to lead and dramatically leading to a lot of different effects that actually shape the way that we view the world today, right? For example, after the European exploration period, you're going to be able to understand why so many people in Central and South America speak Spanish, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that Spain literally launched voyages there, colonized that area, also subjugated a lot of people there, and then also did a lot of other extreme things that led to the ingraining of the Spanish language in these two areas. Why does everybody in America speak English? Oh, because the 13 colonies were founded by the English, and then eventually expanded their way throughout the rest of North America, right? Why do some people in Canada speak French? We'll get into all that as we go. But let's go ahead and do a little real quick thing and actually define what this entire time period is, right? We need to define the era of European... Oh, wow, that was big. Define the era of European exploration and what that actually means. Well, from 1450 to 1550, roughly, what's going to be happening is European kingdoms are going to begin to expand into newly discovered areas, like the Americas, and also infiltrate established markets, right? Now, when I say markets, I mean trade areas, trade destinations, things that they wanted to be a part of that they hadn't been a part of for several hundred years, if not actually when you really look into it, over 1,000 years, right? Because you got to remember when we talked about during the Middle Ages, when we talked about that monsoon marketplace, right? Talked about how from 500 to about 1500 AD, you're going to see the growth of an Indian Ocean trade network, mostly between the Eastern kingdoms, including the Arabs, the Africans, and the Asiatic kingdoms, and they're going to be making tons and tons of money off one another, right? Mostly in the selling, the selling and importation of luxury items from where they're from. The thing about it is, we have now gotten into pretty much the Renaissance period, where Europeans know what's going on. They know stuff is happening over there. They're not stuck in the Middle Ages anymore, so they're trying to get into those markets and make some of that money, right? So something that we need to understand, though, there are several things to remember when you're discussing the period of European exploration, right? You got to understand a couple of little key things real fast. For example, you need to understand the Silk Road, right? You need to understand the Silk Road and the monsoon marketplace that brought goods to Europe already, okay? You have to remember something really quick. The Silk Road was the terrestrial or terrain-based trade route that actually went from East Asia, or pretty much starting mostly in China. It carried luxury items from China all the way through other areas of Asia, through northern India, through the Arab kingdoms, and then it ended in that fun little city called Constantinople, who was later actually called Istanbul. The thing about it, though, is all those products were also coming off of the monsoon marketplace, and they were already feeding a lot of goods into Europe. But the thing about it that you need to remember is that those goods cost a lot, not a little, but a lot of money, right? They were extremely expensive because you were actually moving goods like, let's say, silk from China, and it's going through several different merchants' hands and several different traders' hands, and going through all these different kind of not corporations, but these trade guilds and things like that. Every single time it changes hands, gets more expensive, right? So a big thing that the Europeans are going to try and do a little bit later on is cut those middlemen out and go directly to the source, right? Other big stuff that you need to understand as well is that the Italians, Italy, and the Byzantine, pre-1453, before they fell all to pieces and actually got taken over by the Seljuk Turks, the Ottoman Turks, that was a lie. So the Ottoman Turks, so before 1453 and then after 1453, this place is going to be known as the Ottoman Empire, were two countries that controlled early trade of luxury items into Europe, okay? Italy and the Ottomans/Byzantines controlled the trade routes. I'm going to say this again because it's a study guide question that I get asked about every single year. They controlled the trade routes on land, right? They were the ones that actually accessed the goods from the Byzantine/Ottoman Empire and then brought them into Europe, right? They were very, very expensive, but it's going to lead to the flourishing of the Italians, right? Going into the Renaissance, places like Venice will make tons of money, Florence will make tons of money, and so will Milan as well, right? The thing that we also need to understand is that all of this heavily connects to the Renaissance and the Reformation period. The era of European exploration is happening while the Renaissance is happening and while the Reformation is happening, okay? To give you a couple of dates to kind of just hang your hat on a little bit when we talk about this unit, you need to understand a couple little dates that you can just kind of bookmark in your notes, right? For example, from 1508 to 1512 is when Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, right? That's the high Renaissance when it was meeting its peak, right? 1508 to 1512, that's the Sistine Chapel, okay? Then you also have 1517, was when Martin Luther apparently took that document and then nailed it to the door of a church, right? The thing about it is, of course, we know he didn't do that, but that's the writing of the 95 Theses, okay? So that's a huge event. That happened in 1517. Well, really quick, 1492, before both of those things, was when Columbus set sail to try and find his access route to India, right? So as you can tell, exploration, Renaissance, Reformation, all happening at the exact same time, right? The other big thing you need to understand about it as well is that Europeans wouldn't try to break into these markets until they had the necessary inventions to do so, right? They needed devices and technology, okay? The Europeans didn't always have sophisticated trade vessels like the ones you're seeing in this image, okay? They had a lot of different like trade vessels that had square-shaped sails or were not actually built for long-distance trading. They were actually built for short-distance trading throughout their like port cities and like through the waterways of their own local kingdoms or little neighboring states, right? The thing about it is the Europeans lacked the sophistication at the time to actually go off and find these trade routes to India and other areas as well. Well, really, really quickly, other people had them though, right? Technology and inventions is going to be the very first step to the Europeans actually being able to go off and do these things, okay? Now, the reason why I have inventions in quotes is because most of the things that we're about to talk about, actually all three of the things that we're going to talk about that all start with C, okay? Like, so actually had already been invented by basically Arab or Islamic traders and Italian ones as well. Because what happened was the Arabs and the the Arabs actually learned from the Asians and the Africans as well how to make some of these devices for long-distance trading, and the Arabs then perfected them and made them better. And then when the Arabs began to trade with the Italians, like the Venetians and stuff like that, the city, of course, Venetians is the people who lived in Venice, that one merchant city who brought all the items in. When they began to actually trade with them, cultural diffusion will take place, and slowly these devices will make their way into Europe, and Europeans will learn how to use them, right? And the three big ones that we're going to talk about, I'll start with C, start off with one right here. Cartography, right? Cartography is one of the very serious inventions that needed to happen so Europeans could explore like these different areas and start trying to find new trade routes, right? Cartography is a very fancy word for the science of map making, right? Making effective maps using longitude and latitude lines so you know your position on the earth. Now, there's a lot of other devices that are involved with this for anybody who's listening to this on YouTube right now. There's like, well, what about the astrolabe and the sextant and the quadrant? Yes, all right, those devices go together, though, to make the science of cartography. Right? So or making like cartography possible, right? Now, speaking of cartography, now that I have a map, now I need to know what direction I'm going. So the compass is going to be brought in, which was perfected by the Arabs, right? Magnetic compasses that actually can tell you if you're pointing towards the magnetic north pole of the earth were going to be very, very important. By the way, fun fact, you can actually make a compass using just a leaf, a puddle, and a paperclip, right? Because literally it will be attractive. We got to scrape the paperclip a little bit to actually line up the magnetic poles of it, and then it will eventually actually point north, right? So the compass is a very, very important device that will actually point its direction north and give these sailors some bearing and direction so they can know where they're going, right? And the Arabs have been using this thing for over 100 years, and that already perfected the use of it in general and combined it with that science of cartography, right? Now, caravels is another really, really big one. Speaking of particularly Iberian caravels, which are going to be very, very perfected items based off Arab trade vessels, but caravels are lighter, triangular sailed ships, right? So if you look at this back here, this triangular sail in the back of the actual boat can catch wind going both forward and backwards as well, right? It can actually make it so that the ship itself can travel into the wind or against it in both directions, right? These caravel ships, though, are also going to be fantastic trade vessels because they allow for longer stretches on the water without getting lost and being able to actually zigzag their way through the wind, right? So going into it, though, but where do the Europeans want to get to? And what do they want? Now, this is really, really big, okay? So now that the Europeans have cartography, compass, caravels, they have the devices necessary for actually sailing, but where do these people want to get to? Where do they want to go so bad, right? Well, the place they want to go is actually into that monsoon marketplace, right? So we're talking about breaking into that monsoon marketplace, and breaking into is really, really an operative term. The Europeans ultimately wanted to get to India and the Indian Ocean. That was where they wanted to get to more than anything else because it was a central access point within that monsoon marketplace that had a lot of access to goods that they wanted particularly that were worth a lot of money back in Europe, right? The most valued item, though, at the time, were spices, right? Spices coming mostly from the Indian subcontinent, right? Spices are going to be very, very important for a lot of different reasons. But the spices that grow naturally in India due to the very, very humid and very, very like damp and then also very warm climate are going to be essential market items that are going to make Europeans tons of money. Like to give you a little bit of heads up, these like right here are examples of spices, things like turmeric, cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, coriander, and red chili. The most important of all those spices though was none other than black pepper. Black peppercorns that actually grow off of pepper plants that actually grow in India was like, if you had black pepper on your table in Europe before all this really, really went down, it was like having a Ferrari in the garage, right? Like, for example, in the Dutch language, when Dutch people speak to one another, they have a phrase that has eked its way into their actual language. And when they actually say it to each other, it's like a colloquial saying. Kind of like whenever Americans are just like, oh, I gotta, like, I don't know, what's a funny little saying that Americans have? So for example, like in New Orleans with all the, like, the EAUX, right? And like all that kind of stuff, the bro marts, bro bears, and like the actual, like, infiltration of, like, regular other words into their language. The Dutch have a friendly saying where they say, oh, it's pepperly expensive. Actually referring back to the fact that the Dutch actually traded into some of these early spices later on, and it meant that pepper was just that expensive back in the day, right? So in the 1400s, if you had black pepper on your table, it's like having a Ferrari in the garage, right? So the thing about it, though, is what about these spices can you use them for other than, like, flavoring things, okay? We have to understand that spices have very, very distinct uses, right? One, they can preserve food. They can also flavor that food. They are also very, very good for making medicine, right? Certain things in pepper is going to, like, there's a chemical inside of peppers known as capsaicin, and capsaicin actually opens up your sinuses and makes it easier to breathe. So if you have, like, a cold or something like that, it'll flush all that stuff out. It also makes luxury items, much like perfume, right? But how do they get there, right? Like, how are they going to get there? This is going to be really, really big when we're talking about the growth of European exploration, okay? So something we need to remember and understand is that I'm going to use my face to cover up this side of the map because the Europeans are operating based on a limited knowledge of the globe, right? They want to get to India, which is right there, okay? So we need to understand where they're trying to get to. They're trying to get here, which is India on this map, right? And they're located here in Europe. So how are you going to get from Europe all the way to India? Well, some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, can't you just go along the map right here and just walk like a trade caravan all the way to India? Well, funny enough, no, you can't. That's a really, really great question. But the problem is that the Muslim kingdoms actually control all of northern Africa and all this area in the Middle East. And ever since the Crusades, they do not allow Christian traders to pass through their areas, right? Because they'll actually, like, arrest them and possibly end up executing them and stuff like that if they actually get busted or caught trying to actually move different items through Arab kingdoms, right? So the Arabs locked this area down. Now, some of you are like, well, can't you go up and around them, like into Russia and stuff? Well, no, because it's so cold in this area, right? It's frigid in this area. And there's also a huge mountain range right above India known as the Himalayas that you can't come in through the northern area from, okay? It's very, very cold. Also, the Mongols live out here, and the Mongols, as of the 1400s, are going to also convert to Islam. So they can't go in this direction either. Some of you are like, well, what if I just cut through Africa right here? This is also the Sahara, so you can't go that way either. So they have two ideas, right? One group of people is going to decide, I'm just going to head west, and I'm going to try to pop up on the other side of the earth, right? We'll talk about that guy a little bit later, but then another group's like, we got to go all the way around Africa, right? So the number one thing you have to notice is those inventions, that technology, those boats, all that stuff is going to be necessary because they have to take water routes to get to the prized possession of getting to India to get into that spice market, right? So that's going to be really, really important that you understand so you can so you can do a little bit better on this entire test and understand this unit a little bit better. But you can't go to the east because the Muslims are going to prevent you from going through that way. Can't go through the north because the climate's too cold in Russia, and also the Himalayas are going to stand in your way. And then also going into it as well, can't go through the middle of Africa because the Sahara Desert's there, right? Yeah, also, by the way, don't say Sahara Desert. That's actually dumb because it's saying, like, desert. Now, anyway, so who are the first two countries do we think are going to strike out, though, and get after it and go all the way to India? Well, actually, I'll go ahead and answer it for you. It's none other than the two European countries of Portugal and Spain, right? Portugal and Spain are going to be the very first two places that are going to try and strike out and get to India as fast as they can, right? By the way, might want to go ahead and check Google Classroom, because I'm going to go ahead and post pretty soon a map that you're going to be using for a map quiz next week, right? So make sure you go ahead and double check Google Classroom for the next couple of days, and that's going to be very, very important so you can do really well going into next week, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is the Portuguese, right, the people from Portugal right here on this side, and the people from Spain, okay, or the Spanish, are going to have two different strategies when it comes to getting to India as quickly as they can. Well, the Portuguese strategy is going to start with a very, very old idea of let's go around Africa, right? They're going to decide that they're going to try and lily pad leap all the way over around Africa. funded mostly by their king, Henry the Navigator, right? Well, actually not their king, he's a prince. He's Prince Henry the Navigator. He's actually a brother to the king at the time. And they, being the little country right here on this map, the Portuguese are going to try and bounce their way all the way around Africa to get to India over here in the Indian Ocean. So as you can tell, knowing maps is pretty important for this unit, okay? Now, this is going to take decades to actually accomplish, right? Because they start this whole process right around 1450 to get there, and they're going to have a lot of different failed attempts, right? They're going to have different explorers that try to make it all the way there. They're going to set up trade outposts on the Azores Islands, and they're also, though, going to start setting up forts along the western coast of Africa. And the Portuguese are going to be the ones that begin the African-based slave trade system that is going to become very, very important as we discuss this later on. Because we're going to discuss how awful that thing was, how disgusting it was, and how basically it's going to lead to the spreading of African people in a diaspora throughout other areas of the planet, right? But they're going to be the ones that actually begin to create those forts and begin that slave trade system, right? Now, by 1497, that's when they finally pull it off, right? By 1497, one guy by the name of Vasco da Gama actually makes it all the way around Africa and gets all the way to India, because the biggest area that they were concerned about was this area down here at the southern tip of Africa, which one earlier sailor by the name of Bartholomew Diaz actually referred to it as the Cape of Storms, because it was so bad and so weathery and so tumultuous and filled with just these like really, really, really bad weather patterns, he could never make it past there. Well, Vasco da Gama is the first guy to take 4 vessels all the way around that area and get all the way to India and bring out stuff all the way back. And as the very first Portuguese sailor to make it all the way to India and get all the way back, he makes a ton of money off of the spices that come back. Because remember, y'all, spices were very expensive, okay? And they were very expensive because they traded hands so many times. But this guy, just before Portugal, went all the way there, picked the spices up directly from the source, and went all the way back, saving Portugal a lot of money. They were able to charge us a little bit less for their spices, and they sold them wholesale real quick, right? Making a ton of money for the Portuguese government, and also a ton of money for himself. And then also another big thing we need to understand, though, is because he made it past that southern tip of Africa, became known as the Cape of Good Hope, right? It was located down here. That right there is the Cape of Good Hope, right? Because he said, look, if you can get past there, you're home free. And you hope the fact that India is just right over there, right? But the Cape of Good Hope was at the southern tip of Africa after Vasco da Gama. By the way, a little fun fact about it as well, he also made a bunch of money because he didn't have to pay a lot of his sailors because a bunch of them died from a disease known as scurvy, right? So like now looking into it though, we'll talk about how half of his sailors died from scurvy in class a little bit. We'll talk about how gross a disease scurvy is and stuff like that and how it literally makes your teeth fall out. But the other thing you need to understand though, speaking about breaking into the monster marketplace, is the Portuguese are going to be the very first people to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, get to India in 1497, and come all the way back. But something that some of y'all probably know, I know Addison Persis right now is just like, wait a minute, but I thought Columbus was in 1492. He was. Columbus actually sailed 5 years before that, right? And he actually had already ran into 2 brand new continents that nobody actually knew anything about. But something we need to understand is he sailed for Spain, even though he himself is Italian, right? So like Columbus, an Italian sailor, had the idea to go west, right? And he was like, look, I'm going to head west from Spain, and I'm going to pop up on the other side of the world, right? He actually went to a bunch of Italian government workers first. He went to Genoa, he went to France, trying to beg them for this idea. And he was like, look, I need boats. I need boats to get there, right? And he had the idea to go west, pop up on the other side of the world, and go to India from a southern route. Well, he finally found some suitors after multiple failed attempts, and the suitors are going to be the financiers, the royals of the Spanish crown, by the name of Isabella and Ferdinand. And they're very, very important. As the king and queen of Spain, they're grandma and grandpa to a very important person that we've actually talked about. Charles V, the same guy that told the Pope to tell Henry VIII no from divorcing his aunt, Catherine of Aragon. He is the grandchild of Isabella and Ferdinand, king and queen of Spain, the same people that gave Columbus the money and the ships and the stuff to go off to try and find like his way to get to India, right? Well, the thing about it is he took 3 ships from them and also a 90-10% contract where basically the financiers, or like Isabella and Ferdinand, were like, whatever you find, we get 90% of it, you get 10, right? The thing about it is he took the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, the 3 boats given to him by the Spanish royals, and he found a lot of stuff because he ran into 2 continents nobody ever knew was there. Because after 3 months, Columbus's voyage is going to land in the Bahamas on accident in August of 1492, beginning a huge incursion of Spanish forces into those different areas and leading to a takeover and a colonizing of these areas by Spanish forces. And then also kind of creating a salivating like attempt of like other places like England and France. We're going to want to go off and do the same thing. But more on that later as well. And then tomorrow, whenever we actually get into class, we're going to talk about how they're going to cut up the world and they're going to actually divide the entire thing and keep them from fighting over it a little bit with each other. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.